I am coming from another, I've been on Zoom calls all day back to back, so I'm trying to keep track of everything in my notebook here. But Cammie, thank you again for joining us. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And as I mentioned, I am quite positive you are busy getting calls from lots of areas around the country that are now looking into citizens review boards. Mm-hmm. The way we've done this with previous experts that we've chatted with is we've kind of just gone around and allowed folks on this call to introduce themselves to you so that you have some idea of who it is you're chatting with. And then we'll sort of turn it over to you so you can explain a little bit about your work and your organization, and then maybe generally share with us your thoughts about citizens review boards. And then we have, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 pretty standard technical questions that we'll ask. And if you can help us with it, we'd appreciate it. So I'll go first. My name is Stacy Walker. I serve on the Board of Supervisors here in Lynn County, Iowa. Lynn County is the second largest county in the state. And running for office, and since being elected to office, my focus primarily has been on issues of criminal justice reform and equity within our community. And thus the reason I'm interested in this work, among other reasons. I will now go to Amara, who is next on the list.
Amara Andrews. I am originally a lawyer. I don't practice law anymore. I am barred in California and now live in Iowa. So I have a regular corporate job, but then in my spare time have apparently become a social activist. And so I am part of this group, Advocates for Social Justice, who I don't know if you're familiar with our work, but basically we have made 7 demands of the city of Cedar Rapids, and the first of them is a citizens review board. And so we are sort of a subcommittee of a larger group that is working on this issue.
Okay, Diedrich.
Good afternoon. I'm Dietrich L. Doolin. I am currently the Cedar Rapids branch president of the NAACP. I'm the Iowa-Nebraska State Secretary. I'm also on the in the SPEED National Board of Directors, and I'm also with the African American Family Preservation Resource Committee. So I wear a couple different hats, and I work on civil rights, and try to make sure that diversity in the community is addressed and respected.
Excellent.
Welcome.
Anne.
Unmute. Hi, thanks again, Cammie, for joining us. I am calling myself a community volunteer, sometimes community advocate. It's a euphemism for I'm in a career transition. I was born and raised in Cedar Rapids, and I went to school out east and was away from here for 30 years and then moved back to my hometown. Professionally, I've dealt with matters of equity through diversity, equity, and inclusion work in terms of corporate strategy. And so am participating in this effort to learn, really, but also to contribute in a way that's, and can use my voice in this effort. I'll add that 2 things that I'll add quickly. One is that on those 7 demands, we are at a point where fairly swiftly, if you will, the city council did issue a resolution demonstrating support for all 7 demands. You can talk about the pros and cons and the significance of that or not, but that is a step that we've passed, and that, or a milestone, so to speak. And you had shared with me the recording of the July 1st webinar, so glad that we were able to connect in multiple ways. So thanks again.
Thank you, Anne. Next is Chuck Crawley.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chuck. I am a community activist in Cedar Rapids. I helped form the Big Bang Foundation, where we work with at youth risk. I'm also a coach. I coach basketball and football, and I'm down for the cause. I'm here for the fight.
All right. Thank you, Chuck. And next we have Sammy Sheets.
Hey, so yeah, my name is Sammy Sheets. I'm also born and raised in Cedar Rapids. Most recently served as a political state director for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign in Wisconsin. Stacy's a good friend of mine and wanted to see how I could get involved with all the civil rights action that's been taking place over the past couple months. So I've been doing some background research and been attending and taking notes at the Advocates for Social Justice meetings.
Okay. Thank you, Sammy. And then last but not least on the call is ASJ co-founder Tamara Marcus.
Hi, I'm Tamara Marcus. I am a PhD candidate at the University of New Hampshire, but originally from Cedar Rapids. And I most recently have been really focused on climate change and issues of Indigenous access to science, but have now found myself also being more in the advocacy, social justice advocacy role in Cedar Rapids with the police reform stuff. And as Stacy mentioned, one of the co-founders of the Advocates for Social Justice.
Okay. And that is all I see from our end on the call. Cammie, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself and then share with us a little bit about your work and your experience with citizens review boards.
Absolutely. Well, it's good to meet all of you. This is an amazing collection of advocates on this Zoom call. So it's always nice to be able to speak with people who are in the midst of the work and looking to see how they can move forward faster. My name is Cammie McEllhiney, and I'm actually, although I'm calling from Wisconsin today, I'm from Indianapolis. And I got involved in civilian oversight about 23 years ago. I served on a civilian review board in Indianapolis for 6 years. Learned a lot of lessons, good and bad, from that experience. But it led me to want to be more involved with the organization. I started out as a member and a volunteer, moved on to as a consultant, and did some contract work for them for a while. And now I'm their director of training and education. I use that experience as a member of a review board a lot in my training and education work because of the lack of training and education that any of us received when we started doing the work. So I have been a full-time employee for NACOLE for about 5 years now, and throughout the years, we do several organized activities that help communities, people doing the work of oversight on a daily basis, academics, law enforcement, learn more about oversight and the issues around it. That includes our annual conference, regional meetings, webinar series, and then also the other one full-time employee of NACOLE is my cohort, the director of operations, and she's also been with the organization in one form or another for about 23 years. We spend a lot of time on the phone talking to people, answering questions, and also the wonderful thing about the community, about the oversight community, is that they are more than willing to share information. So there's a large network of, you have a question about mediation? Well, I can tell you all sorts of things about mediation, but I can also hook you up with the people who are doing it in oversight in several different ways. And those individuals are more than happy to share their programs, their lessons learned on a variety of topics, not just mediation. So we like to help people in that way as well, to make sure that you have all of the information you need and not having to reinvent the wheel every time you start a new project. So I don't know if Anne shared the video with all of you, the Civilian Oversight 101.
Yeah, it was shared with us in a previous call. I'm not sure if everybody had a chance to check it out. So if you can readily access it, it might be helpful throwing it in the chat.
Okay, absolutely. another, so we did do that. We are going to do another one live at the beginning of August. We haven't determined the exact date of it, but I'll make sure you're on that email list to get the information when that is published. And the live version will have a lot of the same information that's on that video, but it allows you to also hear other people's questions that they're asking who are going through this, and ask your own questions, which I think is always helpful. I don't know about you, but going through a recorded webinar is never easy for me. And so I'm much more of a fan of the live version if it's accessible. So I can just jump right into some information about oversight. If that's what you would like, Stacy. I'm also happy to be directed in what, I mean, I could talk for hours about civilian oversight, and I want to make sure I give you the information that you most need right now.
So yeah, I think it'll be helpful if you start, and then we do have a few questions we can ask, but we'll probably derive questions based off of what you tell us. So I mean, we're an activist group that hopes to advise municipal elected officials on how they should set up the very best Citizens Review Board. We are looking at other models right now across the country. We've had a great call with an individual who works with the Citizens Review Board out in Oakland, California. Mm-hmm. We've been studying models across New Jersey, particularly the Newark model. Mm-hmm. So we have a pretty baseline understanding of what it is, but if you could point to maybe some of the best practices, maybe even some pitfalls, and if you could give just general advice on a group of people like trying to organize one that's never had one in their community, that would be helpful.
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Ann.
And I'll just interject, because I think one of the points that you make in the training is that how the NACOLE is moving away from best practices to effective practices, and so kind of there's clearly a lot of variety around the country, and so but yeah, best practices will still be part of the lexicon here.
Yes. Okay. Well, so first I'll start by saying, so with civilian oversight, and I think you probably got this sense when you were looking at Newark and listening about the Oakland model, we have about 166 established oversight agencies throughout the country, and no two of those are alike. Now, when I say established oversight entities, those are ones that have been created by ordinance, by legislation, not ones that are advisory boards. I know that I have heard that term in the last month kicked around a lot, a civilian advisory board. And I will say, when I'm talking to you today, I am not talking about that because it's rarely codified. It's normally a way for elected officials and law enforcement to say, look, we have these civilians that are involved in our process. But as soon as that particular mayor leaves or that chief leaves, there's nothing keeping that advisory board around unless you have something that's actually written in stone. And I would say that of those 166, the majority are civilian oversight boards. Now, those vary. There are strengths and weaknesses of each one of them, but the reason that they're different is because each of them have communities that have specific needs and expectations, and also limits. You know, there are issues with local laws that prevent some authority from being given to an oversight agency. There are the gives and takes of trying to get an ordinance passed. I admit I have no idea what your police union looks like in Cedar Rapids, and Newark is an excellent example of what can happen when a police union goes after a civilian oversight entity.
We don't have a formal police union here, by the way, and our police chief is endowed with extraordinary powers, and has signaled a willingness to get this done along with our city council members, as Ann indicated at the top of the call. And so I think our hope here is to try to establish the most effective, the most empowered Citizens Review Board possible. And I think all of us were really excited to learn about some of the unique powers that the Oakland model has.
Yes. Oakland's commission has a lot of power, including everything up to hiring and firing, which they recently did, their chief. And I believe they also have discipline power, which is very rare.
Yep.
So one of the things that I think would be helpful to you, we are very close to publishing a report in the near future. It's from a grant from the Department of Justice that we received under the Obama administration. And I'm sure you can imagine that it's being held up in this current administration because it contradicts everything that they're saying about law enforcement. However, we just got permission to self-publish, so we're hoping in the next 2 weeks that'll be out. In the meantime, though, I can send you some pre-publication summaries of some information, including effective practices. There are about 30 different areas that we studied, and by looking at what other oversight entities across the country were doing, gathered not only the effective practices and explanation of those practices, but also examples. So if you want to know about discipline authority, here are a couple of oversight agencies who already have that and how they're using it. It also includes the 13 principles of effective oversight, which is also in that in the recording that you received. And the 13 principles is where I would suggest to start with looking at how do you build an effective and sustainable oversight entity. And those include everything from independence, stakeholder support, access to law enforcement officials, unfettered access to records and facilities, procedural justice and legitimacy, community outreach, community input. So I think that list and the explanations that go along with those 13 principles will be very useful in the work because they help, not only they help build effective oversight, they help sell it to make sure that one of the things that we're finding and have always found when there is a community, particularly if there's one who's had an officer involved shooting, for instance, that time when the community is in crisis, stakeholder support, particularly with elected officials, is not hard to find. The problem is 3 months down the road, a year down the road, 5 years down the road, it seems to wane. And so one of the things that these principles do is work towards building that support that is long lasting, that outlasts the outcry and the media attention. And so we're really emphasizing that in this moment because we finally have the world paying attention. But what happens in 5 weeks when CNN decides that's not the leading story? And so it's about doing that work underneath of building the support so that no one can say no once it's already done. So I will send that to you.
Brought that up. I'm really glad you brought that up. That has been a chief concern, I would say, of this group in trying to move quickly on this. We want to move quickly, but we don't want to get it wrong, right? We want to do this right, but you know, we are combating the suggestion and insistence of others in this community who would like a 3 to 4 month process. And, you know, I'm personally worried, and I feel like a lot of other folks are worried that, you know, when this community stops sharing the Black Lives Matter hashtag and we find another crisis to care about, that it's going to give, you know, namely elected officials an opportunity to maybe not push for an aggressive a system here. So I'm really glad that you just said that out loud, because that's exactly where we're at in this process.
Yeah, it's a huge concern. And so we have been working as fast as we can to get on as many of these as possible to make sure that people can move forward fast. I would say, you know, and the other piece of that is that also when there is this outcry, most times we hear people say, oh, well, if we just have a civilian review board with subpoena power, then it will fix everything. We'll be perfectly fine after that. And unfortunately, that is just not the case. You know, in Newark, for instance, the reason they have not reviewed a case really yet is because they have been dealing with legal action from the union about subpoena power. And so I will say subpoena power is important when you need that last resort, when you're not getting cooperation. I would say that having a review board that not only has the ability to review investigations that are done about misconduct, I do think there needs to be a proactive element. I think that that is imperative in any oversight mechanism. And traditionally, we don't see that in review mechanisms or in review boards because they were just meant to kind of act in a reactionary way to misconduct complaints that were filed. So some of the ways that we're seeing oversight agencies take that proactive stance is by having a component where they're able to review policy and make recommendations. And not only are they able to do that, but that law enforcement is mandated to reply to those recommendations in a certain amount of time. I think that also having the ability to do audits and bringing in that component is really important. I will say that I use this example frequently. My cohort Liana, used to be the police auditor in the city of Tucson. She noticed that there were these complaints. They were all chokehold complaints, which is against their general orders. She noticed that she was getting complaint after complaint after complaint. And she looked at them side by side in an audit, and she realized that all of the badge numbers were in sequence, which means they were all most likely from the same recruiting class. So she was able to go back and look at the training, and she realized that they were trained by someone who was from another law enforcement agency, where the chokehold was permitted. So she was able to go in, get that entire recruit class retrained, and to solve the problem before it continued. So I do think in auditing and having that ability to make recommendations about training, policy is so important, because then it's not just dealing with misconduct that's in hand, it's also helping to prevent it in the future. And I think that's why we haven't seen more progress in police reform through civilian oversight over the last years, because that is new to civilian oversight. That's within the last 15 years that has become more prominent. So, and still not in all of the 166 agencies. So I do think that is something to look at, and it is in that list of effective practices that I'll send you. Another thing that I would like to send you is another summary from that publication on models, so that you have a good understanding of what that model can look like, and also what a hybrid of it can look like. And also something that will also help in the selling and the building of support through stakeholders is the benefits of civilian oversight. I think everyone on this call probably knows all of them already, but I do think that sometimes it's nice to be able to hand a piece of paper to someone and say, okay, maybe this will help you understand why everybody needs to be on board. So that will be, there's 4 publications that I will send to you following this call. I'll try to put it in the chat. Actually, I think I can send you a link to all of those. And I think that those will help, particularly as you're working to make concrete recommendations in a very quick way. Something else that I can do is, so we're getting ready to launch an online toolkit, which is built out of a civilian oversight agency database. So we've already collected about 60, almost 70 agencies worth of data, which includes what type of model they are, what type of authorities they have, their enabling legislation. So we can give that to you so that you have examples all the way through. You can look and say, oh, so these particular oversight agencies have subpoena power. They have policy recommendation authority. And then you can say, you can look at a line and say, this is what I want. And this is the enabling legislation that fits with what I'm looking for. Particularly if you're working in a very short time frame, I think that will help to streamline the process and not have to start from scratch. So I'll send that to you as well. It is kind of a cumbersome. There's like 60 plus data points. It's a little cumbersome, but I'll try to pull out the things that I know will not be helpful in this circumstance to try to make it a little bit more user-friendly for you. And then of course, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll have the online version available, but it sounds like you would rather not wait 2 weeks for that information. So
That's right. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
okay. Make a note, make sure I get all of those to you. So I also think on our website, I don't know if you've come by it, there is under our resource section, there's also another report that speaks specifically about strengths and weaknesses of each model. It's called Assessing the Evidence. It is several years old now, but it still is pretty good about talking about the different kinds of models and what the pros and cons of each one are. And I will say that a civilian review board tends to be the most palatable for a city, and for several reasons. It has the community component, which is very important. It's a low cost option. You know, an independent investigation model where you take investigation misconduct completely away from the police department is incredibly expensive because you have to maintain certified specialized investigators for that kind of work. And also there are some cities that are a little smaller who are able to staff those boards with people who might also staff another similar or board that kind of doing kind of the same work. For instance, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they have a review board. The person who staffs that not only staffs the review board, but also the Human Rights Commission. So that way you can also, if there's any kind of question about budget for them, that seems to help. Because I will say the other conversation we're having with a lot of cities is how do I do this when our budget has been completely decimated by COVID? But I still have the support to do it, but there's just not a lot of money to do it. So we do like to kind of give some of that information out as well so people can think about that. I will say though, one of the principles and also just an important aspect of when you're forming this is to make sure that the budget for this is adequate. So you don't want to, so often with an oversight entity, and a city gives them authority, gives them a large mandate, and gives them a budget that makes it almost impossible to carry out that mandate. So you need to make sure that the budget for staff is high enough so that if you have people doing policy analysis, that you can actually hire someone who knows how to do policy analysis, not someone who has never done it, but you think they might be able to get it really well. You know, you just want the people that can do the work and have enough money to keep them there. The other piece is constant training. So one of the things that we recommend highly for boards is that part of the ordinance mandates training. And I do think, and not everyone agrees with me, I do think training from the law enforcement agency is important. I think it's important to know how they are trained on general orders, so that you kind of know what it's like to do the work that they're doing. At the same time, and that also includes things like ride-alongs. When I was on a board, I was mandated to do 16 hours of ride-alongs a year, 20 hours of training at the academy a year. But I think it's also very important to be doing training with civil rights organizations, to self-promote with NACOLE, so that you have information on civilian oversight aspects as well. So civilian oversight, civil rights, and law enforcement are all aspects of the training that need to be paid attention to. And that's one of the reasons when I talked about learning lessons, good and bad, when I became a civilian review board member, it was because I saw what was happening in my community and I wanted to do something. I knew nothing about civilian oversight. I didn't even realize it existed outside of my city. I didn't really know anything about general orders or how police were mandated to do their job. And I had the civil rights aspect pretty well down, but still not in that context necessarily. So that is one of those things that I've realized is really important to make sure, so that they can do the job that they've been mandated to do. With that, I think the rest of the information that you're looking for will be in the documents that I send. So I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for you to ask me questions as well.
Thank you for that, Cammie. And I do think this is a great time to start asking the questions with about a half hour left in the call. So I will open it up to the group. Does anybody here on the Zoom have any questions in response to what Cammie has shared with us? Or I know we have a few prepared questions that folks may want to ask. So go ahead.
Well, I'm just wondering what you have seen work in smaller cities like Cedar Rapids. So cities that aren't particularly diverse, where the police force is certainly not diverse, and that are smaller. I mean, we talked with someone from Oakland. That obviously is not, it's not the same. It was valuable listening to her, but you know, our city is not that size, obviously.
Right.
Our metro area is
Oh,
about 150.
sorry if my connection's bad.
Oh, no worries.
Thank you. So the city itself, about 150,000 metro area. Maybe you'll see reports that say 250,000, but certainly surrounded by large, rural swaths.
So there are some cities that I might direct you to that I'm not sure that they have all of the authorities that I would want to suggest to you, but they at least have that issue of being a smaller town that is without an immense amount of diversity. You know, I think that one of the things that helps in situations like that, I think the review board model is kind of a natural choice because it's smaller, as long as it has a couple of other authorities attached to it, like the policy recommendations. Something else to make, because it isn't an incredibly diverse community, that part of the ordinance mandates participation or appointments on that board from different organizations in the city. And I see small cities do that and large ones. So for instance, you know, maybe half of the board is made up of members appointed, suggested, and then confirmed by council from maybe the NAACP, maybe ASJ, maybe whatever groups are most prevalent, and speak to for as many voices as possible in your community. That way you don't end up with a board that then doesn't necessarily have people on it who understand the issues and why the board exists. And I will say that's happened in Indianapolis. It doesn't have that mandate. And so there are periods of time where you have a board that doesn't represent all of the voices that need to be represented. So that is something that I would suggest.
Any other questions?
You mentioned a lot of like best practices or like things to kind of focus on for successful review boards. And then you also mentioned, you know, not to focus so much on the subpoena power part of it, which is something that we also heard from the representative from Oakland. I'm wondering if there are other things that are less important, I guess, you know, maybe to spend less time and energy on trying to get past, similar to the subpoena power issue.
Well, I will say subpoena power is at the top of that list. It's often what people say that they draw the line and say they must have subpoena power, and then that the fight then centers around that. The rest of what I would say would be recommended is pretty necessary and not as controversial. One of the things that sometimes helps with the issue of subpoena power is having that mechanism for unfettered access to records, so that as you're doing reviews of investigations, or some review boards do have the ability to initiate their own investigation or to initiate a re-investigation if you decide to go that route. And so it is important that you have access to every last bit of records and witness information. So things like that I think are very important. But I wouldn't say, I think that putting down everything that you're asking for is important. And then looking at it, once you get the feedback, once it's actually out there and an ordinance is out there with all of the authorities that you've chosen, I think then you can step back and say, okay, of this, where is your line? And it might be subpoena power. That might be an issue. I would also caution, as you think about it, it sounds like you have a very cooperative situation right this moment. You have a chief that's willing. You're all smiling, so I'm not sure that is.
we have a chief and elected officials who have committed conceptually to doing this.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So I definitely will send those benefits of civilian oversight. And one thing I can also do is we have some chiefs out there who are incredibly supportive, like in practice, not just in voice, of civilian oversight. And I'm happy, they tend to be very excited about preaching civilian oversight to other law enforcement. So I'm happy to help that happen as well.
That would be great. If we could get a couple names to reach out to, it'd be nice for us to even do a Zoom call with a law enforcement official. I think that could be really helpful. Yeah. And Cammie, just to be clear, for my own edification, you weren't saying that subpoena power is unimportant or it should be toward the end of the list of things we fight for. It's just oftentimes that is the fight. And if the goal of a subpoena power is to have unfettered access to information, if we can achieve that elsewhere, it may not be necessary. Is that, I just want to make sure I hear that.
Yes, I think that, I mean, I would like to see all oversight agencies have subpoena power. Mm-hmm. I know there are those that don't have it that can still do what they're mandated. So if there's something about just saying those two words that raises the hair on the back of law enforcement's neck, and then all of a sudden that becomes the impediment to actually establishing civilian oversight. So if you can obtain it in other ways, that's also good. I say ask for it for sure, but I don't think it's what you lay down and die for if you can achieve it in other ways.
That makes sense. Any other questions?
Do you know, this is Sammy, do you know of any other towns or cities similar to our size? I think we said 150 to 250,000, where if there's a dispute between, let's say there's the Internal Affairs Division finds and gives some sort of corrective action or punishment from sort of dispute or excessive force or what may be, and then there's a dispute between that and the Civilian Review Board. Are there any examples of towns our size where the review board can actually correct that action and that what they have, basically what their final say, has teeth? Do you know of any examples of that?
Yeah, there are a few even large cities that have that option. So normally what happens if you review a case and you don't agree with the disposition, you bring that disagreement and what you would like it changed to the chief. And then in many cities, it just sometimes the chief says, no, I'm not going to do that. In most cities that have the way that they're dealing with that effectively is that time limit and mandate for response. So what happens is that you have a chief who disagrees. They are required by ordinance to give a written explanation, say within 30 to 60 days, that it says exactly why they agree or disagree with the change in disposition. Then that becomes public record. And I think, and then also that type of information is reported in an annual report. That's one thing I didn't mention, but I do think the reporting that goes out by a civilian oversight agency is imperative. It builds that level of transparency that the community needs and craves from law enforcement that's normally shrouded in secrecy and what happens. And so I think that although many don't have that mandate, there are ways that they work around that to make sure that they're able to get the information out, and they hold law enforcement accountable for their disagreements or agreements with civilian oversight.
I can't remember what Natasha shared with us about how disputes like that are handled in Oakland, but I do remember it being pretty interesting. But I love the idea of the written report becoming public record. And I even floated internally with this group, maybe a week or so ago, a mechanism that would allow these disputes to be voted on by council, understanding that there would be privacy concerns. There's a way to do it, but so say the chief wants to settle it this way and the Citizens Review Board wants to settle it this way, you take that matter to council, protecting the confidential information. Of course, they can learn about that information in a secret meeting or a private meeting, or we call them closed sessions here. Mm-hmm. They could learn about all of the details, but then discuss the dispute publicly. And if you put it to your publicly elected officials to have to vote on an issue, whether they're going to side with the police on this complaint or side with the public, I think it adds another level of accountability and transparency there. I'm not sure if there are any communities in the country that do it that way, but it strikes me as a way to get at that mediation in a fair, accountable way.
So, the issue, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that is a very interesting concept. I do not know of any oversight agencies who have that ability. I'll do a little research and see if there are any, but that's a very interesting concept of how to deal with that at a whole nother level. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Any other questions from the group?
I think there was one in the chat. Hold on a second. Examples of benefits of a civilian review board. So protection of civil and human rights, that is one of them. It's having a community voice in a process that tends to be very opaque. And those are just two. Some of the benefits that come for not so much selling points for community members, but for elected officials, is that there is a risk management component to this. There's been some research, particularly out of Northwestern University, about the correlation of having oversight and the decrease in lawsuits settlement dollar amounts in cities. And so there are those types of benefits as well. Those type of benefits are normally lowest on my list because I would like it to not get to that point. But those are the type of benefits, and I'll make sure, Chuck, to send out that list that we kind of our one pager as well to get some of that information out.
Thank you for that, Cammie. We do like Northwestern University. I could see Ann's face light up when you mentioned that. So I'm sure we may have some other questions and we may not, I don't know, but I think it would be helpful, Cammie, if you could just recap what it was you were going to send to us so that we know what to expect. And I'll jot it down too.
Okay, absolutely. So there are 3 pre-publication summaries that I'm going to send to you. One is on the principles of civilian oversight. One is on the models of oversight. And then the third one is a very it's a summary of effective practices that are recommended. So if you're looking at an oversight agency and you want to know about what are the recommended staffing levels, or what is the recommended training, or how civilian review boards are chosen, how members are chosen, that has a summary list of that. And if there are any of those, that one was, to make it a summary, we had to really take a lot out. So if there are particular pieces of that you want more information on, just let me know and I'll send you the blurb that goes with that particular recommendation. Otherwise, it would have been more like another report rather than a summary. So
what was the first one you mentioned out of that list of 3?
the principles of civilian oversight.
Got it. Thank you.
I'm also going to send you a one-pager on the benefits of civilian oversight. I'll also send you the data from our Civilian Oversight Agency database.
Got it. That's excellent. Ann and Tam, you two are sort of the self-appointed drafters of the recommendations that we are going to put out. Anything else you think might be helpful?
I don't think so. Not at this time.
Yeah, it sounds like all of that stuff you would give to the general public, right? These are documents that you would share with them directly, or is this more, are the documents you're sending more for like a higher level of development?
Well, that's kind of a hard question to answer because we have really just developed them into the last 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And we are just trying, so it's not something it's not on our website, but we are distributing it to any community that needs more information.
So
I'll
I guess,
say it that way.
yeah, if there are any maybe, more used documents that you do that are more geared towards the general public for education,
Yeah.
those would definitely helpful resources.
Yeah, I will send you, I mentioned another report that we do send out frequently, and then I'll also send you, we developed it's been several years ago now, a guide for implementing or enhancing civilian oversight of law enforcement, and it was done actually for a project for Mexico, so, but applicable here. It just, you probably need to take it and speed up the timeline considerably on it, but it does have, it's kind of a step-by-step of, okay, I need to get stakeholder support, then I need to think about staffing. So it might be a useful outline or checklist of things to think about as you're going through the process. So I'll send that to you as well. So that's a kind of a guidebook on establishing civilian oversight.
Cammie, thank you for that. A couple quick other sort of rapid fire questions that you could either answer now or via email.
Okay.
But it's sorry, there's a train right outside my office, but
No worries.
who else should we be talking to on this issue? And that can be people or organizations. Any sort of model CRBs that stick out in your mind? Again, we were just really amazed at what Oakland has been able to do. And heading into that conversation, we had been doing a lot of reading about Newark. So any other sort of models that we can look to as examples of ones who got most of it right? Mm-hmm. And then I think you mentioned earlier, a couple either police chiefs or former chiefs who are champions. I think having a Zoom call with a law enforcement official who believes in this would be really, really beneficial because we, and I don't know if I shared this with you, but we do expect to share all of this work, including these Zoom calls with other folks in the community who want to learn about it. So just having that as a resource would be helpful.
Okay, absolutely. So I will actually, I probably would be best to put some of this in email form so I can also give you the contact information.
Great.
But I do think some information on who to talk to. I think that it would be good to talk to some of our oversight directors who also get, they understand that community is part of this process, and so they completely still understand the role of community even after it's established. And I think that that's an important perspective to have, particularly since you guys are working to create it. And then how do you maintain community perspective in the process down the line? And not once it's handed over to a director. And then I think I can definitely send you some model CRBs from different size cities. And they will be model CRBs for different reasons. We are still looking for the perfect CRB model. And
that,
you know,
for the record, that's what I'm most interested in, is not necessarily ones that make sense, you know, for a population or for the demographics of a population, because I think we can extrapolate that. But just if the unicorn exists, or the most perfect one, or the one that includes the most effective practices, right? So that we can draw from those. I think that would be really helpful.
Absolutely. And as far as law enforcement is concerned, I'll send you some contact information. There's a chief out of Tucson, Arizona, who is, he's phenomenal. He is not immune to controversy, but he is, I have seen few chiefs who could have taken on the reform efforts that he's taken and supported civilian oversight. In fact, he's the type of chief who wants civilian oversight as a voting member on a use of force review board, which that is not common, and is looking to work with the mayor to increase the authority of their auditor and their civilian oversight board that's there. So I think he'd be great to talk to anybody, and talk to your chief, elected officials, whatever. And then also, actually, we also have on our board, she's not a police chief, she's an former elected sheriff. And that's even rarer, rare phenomenon to find an elected sheriff who is pro-civilian oversight. But she's done a lot of work nationally with sheriffs and police chiefs, and I think she's a good voice there too, and could be helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will work on getting all of that information to you, including the unicorn. And then once you have a chance to absorb some of it, don't hesitate to reach out.
Hey, Cammie. Hey, Cammie.
Yeah.
Cammie, can you tell me what is a realistic time to establish a citizens review board?
Well, you know, it's sometimes a realistic time. I mean, I'm thinking if you have complete will to establish it from elected officials, and and the fact that you don't have the union there, that works very well in your favor. Because normally that tends to be the biggest hitch in the process. I don't know if you could do it in less than 2 months, maybe 3. I mean, but there are also cities that it's taken them 20 years. So, but they didn't have the will. They didn't have any political will. They only had community will. So I don't see how you could do it in less than 2 months.
Right, and I think, you know, Diedrich is probably hinting at something. What we didn't want was the sort of information gathering process to take 4, 5, 6 months, because we know that CRBs have been around for 40 years, and we know that organizations like NACOLE exist to help with that. So, you know, Diedrich, you know, I'm willing to say on this Zoom, and even to say publicly, you know, yeah, we want to get it done as soon as we can, but we just know that there's too many effective and best practices out there to spend, you know, a half a year researching it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that, I mean, I'm hopeful that when you see the documents I'm going to send you, that in itself will be kind of a laundry list of what authorities you want to pick and choose from. Whereas that didn't exist a year ago. So I think that your process for research will be much smaller. And then what you'll really have to worry about is once you have a draft and recommendations, then how much time it takes on the other side that you have less control over.
Okay. Well, Cammie, we are sorry to load you up with so much homework.
No worries.
But we really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule, as I'm sure you've just been blowing up and you've become a hot commodity given this sort of human rights liberation movement that's happening across the U.S. So we really do appreciate you, and we will be in touch.
Well, it's great meeting all of you, and we have been waiting for everybody to join the party. So we're here to help.
Excellent.
We've been stocking up information for everyone. So,
Great.
so thank you.
Thank you so
Been
much,
speaking
Cammie.
with all of you.
Yep. You take care.
Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thanks.